Good afternoon. It is good to see you all. I am so grateful this morning. I am grateful to be back at Calvary Episcopal Church for the Lenten preaching series in its 101st season. Congratulations, Calvary. You don't look a day over 100. I am grateful to my beloved friend, Scott Walters, for inviting me back to preach this year. Thank you, Scott. I'm grateful to Katie Leopard, who has been so patient with me as we have gotten ready for this sermon, for everybody who works to make this happen. This is such an incredible labor of love that this community puts together every year. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So I want to start out this afternoon by talking about this story from the second book of Kings, chapter 2. It's sort of a funny little Hebrew Bible story, and by funny I mean it's an absolutely horrific Hebrew Bible story. It's seldom told and preached about, but it's a story of which I have always been very fond. And in this story, the prophet Elisha is walking out of town, and he is accosted by a group of young men, probably teenagers, and they start ripping on him for being bald. In the King James Version, they say, "Go up, thou bald head." In the New Revised Standard Version, they resort to, "Get out of here, baldy." And it seems, at least at first, like it's pretty typical teenage behavior, right? I was a youth pastor for a couple years before I started at Church of the River, and let me tell you, nobody can launch a devastating insult like a teenager. So Elisha understandably takes some offense to this, and then to put it very mildly, he takes his response a little bit far. He calls down a curse from God upon these young people, and bears come ripping out of the woods and grievously injure 42 of them. And then Elisha just keeps on walking down the road as though nothing weird just happened. So this story is undeniably bizarre. My wife Sandra would say, "I have so many questions." But I would argue that the story also has a lot to teach us if we let it. So I want to start out by backing up just a little bit. We're still in the second chapter of the second book of Kings, just a couple paragraphs earlier. Elisha is with his beloved mentor and friend Elijah. So this is where it gets a little tricky, because in this book we have Elisha and Elijah, and it's confusing. I do apologize, I didn't write it. So in this earlier scene, Elijah tells Elisha that it is time for Elijah to die, to return to the home from whence he came. And Elisha really struggles with this, and he begs his friend and his mentor Elijah to stay, but Elijah insists that it is his time, and Elijah is swept up to heaven in a celestial chariot, and Elisha is left on his own, and he cries, and he collapses, and he tears his clothes, and then he continues on his way. And it is in this state of grief that we find him when these teenage boys approach him. Elisha is in a raw, tender place, and these teenagers start to poke at him. And it's interesting to me that they talk about him being bald, because I would argue that these aren't just idle teenage jabs. If we want to understand why Elisha got so angry, we need to understand a little bit more about Elijah. Because earlier in the Hebrew Bible, Elijah is described as wearing a garment of hair. And this could mean a couple different things, right? It could mean that Elijah was kind of a hairy guy and had long hair and a long beard and was a sort of a hairy guy. And it could also mean, and probably means, that Elijah was wearing a hair shirt. He was wearing this intentionally uncomfortable garment made out of hair that would have marked him as a prophet. So, these young men approach Elisha, and they're not just saying, "Ha ha, you're bald." They're saying, "You are less than Elijah, who came before you." They're saying, either you have less body hair than he did, or more likely, Elijah wore a hair shirt, your body is bald, you are less devout, you are less of a prophet than Elijah. Your bald, beloved friend and mentor, or you're not bald, your beloved friend and mentor who just died, they jab him in a particularly sensitive place, and he overreacts. And the result is an utter disaster in which many people are seriously hurt. And I think that is the lesson of the story. That's the meaning of the story in our time. Here we have a person who is grieving. We have a person who's just been traumatized. And this person is walking along, attempting to carry on and live his life. And still in his grieving state, somebody says the wrong thing to him, and he responds with horrible violence. And I tell you this story here and now at Calvary Episcopal Church in Memphis, Tennessee in the year 2024 because I believe that all of us in this room, all of us watching this sermon online are close to having some kind of Elisha and the bears moment. All of us have just lived through 4 years of a deadly global pandemic, which traumatized and continues to traumatize us all. We have just lived through the Trump presidency, which created a culture that was polarizing and damaging both, I would argue, to the people who hated him and to the people who loved him. And every day we are greeted with news of violence and heartbreak, both abroad, across the world, and right here in our own community in Memphis. We are all of us living through trauma. And our work as faithful people is to acknowledge that trauma and to acknowledge the ways in which that trauma continues to affect us. You know, in my work, I talk to so many people who make it so clear to me that they want to move forward. They want to be done with the pain and the trauma of COVID-19, with the lockdown and the canceled milestones and the piles of bodies on the streets in New York City and elsewhere. People want to put it all behind us. It's been 4 years. And it's my job to tell you, I am so sorry, but no. It's my job to tell you that after a traumatic event has ended, after the acute trauma of the event has ended, that is when we begin to process the traumatic event. And when we attempt to just continue on with our lives as though nothing terrible has just happened, the result is very often disastrous. The result is often that in our rawness and in our brokenness, in the bareness of our emotions, we end up causing terrible hurt. I think about the young men who made fun of Elisha for being bald. These young men were traumatized too. These young men had also just lost the great prophet Elijah, and they were acting out and saying deeply hurtful things, and they could have made a kinder choice. They could have not mentioned that Elisha was bald, but even so, they deserved grace, and Elisha should have given it to them. And I will say, in a room that is full of my esteemed colleagues in ministry and religious leadership, because it is not often that I get to preach to a room that has this many of my colleagues in it, it is not lost on me that Elisha was a person in a position of religious authority. It's not lost on me that when these young men were acting out in their trauma, they went and attacked a clergy person, because we are easy targets, aren't we? And it is also not lost on me that this prophet, this religious leader who owed it to these young people to give them a break and a little understanding, instead he called a curse from God down upon them. He was triggered, he was grieving, and he used his authority as a religious leader to cause people serious harm. When we pretend that we are okay, when we attempt to go through the motions and don't give our own pain the respect and space that it deserves, that, my beloved colleagues, is when we are capable of causing the most harm. And this is made more complicated because we do have to live our lives and do our jobs. We do have to move forward somehow. Elisha was right to pick up Elijah's staff and move. We can't cry and tear our clothes forever, but we also can't just pretend that our trauma didn't happen. So what can we do? I've got a couple ideas. The first is to reconsider the roles of our higher powers. Just to speak from experience for a minute, I've spent a few years now reeling from this pandemic and from the losses that I have experienced in the last 4 years and change, and I've been praying less than I used to. I've been doing my spiritual practices less, and I realized recently it's because I've been angry with God. I've been angry with God for the pandemic and for the disaster of the state of American politics and for the violence in Gaza and for the deaths of my 2 nieces and the list goes on. And so I've grown resentful of God, not just for the things having happened, but for the pain and the grief that I still feel. Because deep down, there's still this part of me that hasn't been able to grow past the idea that if God just loved me enough, then God would simply take the pain away. And that part of me has been angry that it hasn't happened like that. And I've been walking around with a chip on my shoulder, half ready to call down the bears on anyone who crosses me. And so my journey for the past little bit, and I imagine you may be on a similar journey as well, has been a journey away from the God I used to believe in and towards a God who does not take grief away, but who instead can accompany us in our grief, who is with us all in our grieving, and who loves us through our ugliest and most shameful moments. The second possible step forward that I've been able to come up with is that we talk about it. And we continue to talk about it. We talk not just about the numbers and the news, but we talk about the pain that we are in. We accompany each other in all of our grief and all of our pain. And this is the work of our churches and religious institutions as well. It is to be places that can welcome us and accompany us in all of our worst moments, the moments when we are a walking raw nerve just ready to say or do something awful in this time. That is the role of our religious institutions. I'm going to say this loud and clear, my beloveds. The worst thing that our congregations could do right now would be to attempt to get back to the way things were before the pandemic. I'm going to say it again. The worst thing that our congregations could do right now would be to attempt to get back to the way things were before the pandemic. Because to do that, to attempt to emulate the pre-pandemic church would be to utterly fail to acknowledge the ways in which our world has changed, the ways in which we have changed. To attempt to bring back the church of 2019 or before would be to deny the contents of our very souls. It would be to push down and away all that we have experienced in the past 4 years, and if we do that, we will end up hurting each other. We will end up like those teenagers following each other around, thoughtlessly hurling viciousness at each other, and we will end up like Elisha, using the power that we do have to cause terrible harm. Our work as faithful people is not to remove each other's pain. It is not to undo each other's suffering, nor is it to pretend that our pain and suffering isn't there. Our work now and always is to embody God's love to the best of our ability. Even if you don't believe in God, our work is to love each other as unconditionally as we can manage. The purpose of our religious institutions is not to make everything okay. It is to love each other through everything not being okay. I think about Elisha walking along and encountering these young people, and I wonder about what could have happened if they had taken the time to understand each other, if these young people had been able to see Elisha's pain, if he had been able to see their pain, if they had been able to encounter each other as the hurting people that they were. Our work as faithful people is to attempt to make that happen. It is to love each other as we are, as the people who sometimes say and do terrible things and who are also capable of so much love and compassion and grace, and to accept the love that we are given as well, as we are, today, tomorrow, and the day after. Amen.
Sam will be at the foot of the steps as we leave this place. Would you stand as you're able? Go forth into the world in peace. Be of good courage. Hold fast to that which is good. Render to no one evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the afflicted. Show love to everyone. Love and serve, rejoicing in the power of the Spirit, and the blessing of God be with you and remain with you always. Amen. Thank you for that. You know I need it. Right?
They're all good, but that one was especially.